right? So every year, vast quantities of gas are sailing overseas and we're getting very little return from it. We need to start taxing them seriously right now because it's sailing overseas as we speak. We are losing billions and billions of dollars every year because we're failing to get a fair return for our resources.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows. I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains politics, policy and economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and last week our Executive Director, Richard Dennis, addressed the National Press Club in a debate against independent member for Wentworth, Allegra Spender, about Labor's proposed changes to the Stage 3 tax cuts. And one part of his speech in particular really took off on social media.
Consider the fact that in Norway, they tax the fossil fuel industry and they give university education to their kids for free. In Australia, we subsidise the fossil fuel industry and we charge our kids a fortune to go to uni. Choices matter. And the Australian government collects more money from HECS than it does from the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax. Thank you, children. You're the backbone of our economy, not the gas industry.
People were gobsmacked and outraged by this statistic. But this is a fact. The Australian government collects more revenue each year from students paying HECS than it does from gas companies paying the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax. This shocking fact has sparked a national conversation about fairer tax reform and how Australia collects its revenue and from whom. So to unpack all this, I'm joined today by Mark Ogge, Principal Advisor at the Australia Institute. G'day, Mark.
Hi, Ebony.
So, Mark, to kick us off, first of all, let's start off with the basics. What exactly is the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax?
The Petroleum Resource Rent Tax is a tax on super profits. So it's not just on the ordinary profits a company would make, but it's the profits well and truly above the ordinary rate of return that you would get. And it's often referred to as resource rents. So what it's designed to do is, because sometimes we get big increases in the price of gas.
Like when there's a war in Ukraine, for example.
Like the war in Ukraine, companies make vastly more money for doing exactly the same thing. And they're making that money from selling resources owned by the Australian community. So they're not really doing anything for that extra money. And the super profits tax is meant to get some of that return for Australians.
And how well does it do its job, Mark? How much revenue roughly per year does the Australian government bring in from the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax?
Not very much at all is the short answer. It varies between less than $1 billion and probably up to around $2.5 billion when gas prices are high. But interestingly, over the last decade or so, as production has tripled in Australia, the taking of the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax has fallen over time. And the reason is there's just ridiculous loopholes all over the place that allow gas companies to basically get away without paying it.
Petroleum Resource Rent Tax.
Be some big tickles to the so-called Petroleum Resource Tax, the PRRT.
Which essentially means that offshore producers of oil and gas are taxed at about 40% under the proviso that they are profiting off Commonwealth resources.
Amidst of economic turmoil, the industry that still burns brightly Australian gas companies are taking in record profits as prices soar.
Australian governments, a whole bunch of them over decades, have made mistakes with the tax, saying it's too generous. He says we've ended up with a tax that basically doesn't collect any money from key gas production sites and may never do so.
This PRRT has been generating relatively puny amounts for decades.
It's been seen and criticised very widely as an ineffective tax measure, given how we've seen the war in Ukraine drive gas prices through the roof, but revenue from the PRRT, as it's known, hasn't really followed along with that.
So let me get that straight. Australia has tripled its production of gas and its exports, and we're pulling in less money from the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax.
Yeah, exactly. It's outrageous.
Oh my, that's just ridiculous. No wonder the government's having an inquiry into this. They're proposing some changes to the PRRT.
Treasurer Jim Chalmers has confirmed changes to the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax in Tuesday's budget.
Because he wants to raise billions of dollars more in taxes from offshore oil and gas companies to spend on the cost of...
Is that why they're looking into it? Because everyone knows that it's broken?
I mean, it's been building for a long time. People have been are realising that the oil and gas industry really is fleecing Australians and taking vast quantities of our resources without giving a return to the Australian community. And after all, we own the resource. And people are realising that and are getting angry. And I think the government's realised that and also realised that it needs to find ways to gain more revenue and feels that there's support out there in the public to actually increase the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax.
So, Mark, presumably other countries also collect revenue in various ways from their gas industry. How do other countries do it?
So other countries do it through royalties and taxes, but also very often state-owned oil and gas companies where the revenue goes to the government. They generally tax or collect a lot more revenue than the Australian government. So, for instance, Qatar produces roughly the same amount of gas as Australia, but collects about 20 times as much revenue from that gas. And Norway collects many, many times more than Australia as a proportion of the overall income generated by the gas. And they've been clever enough to put that into an enormous sovereign wealth fund, which returns around, I think it's around $350,000 to every Norwegian. So a huge amount of money going back to the citizens of the country, whereas in Australia, we've just allowed these big multinational oil and gas companies to take that money, and we're left with very little to show for it.
It's bizarre, isn't it? I mean, Australia is an energy superpower. We have an abundance of just about every source of energy imaginable, and yet we've got multinational companies making extraordinary windfall profits, whilst Australian households and Australian manufacturers reliant upon energy are getting it in the neck. It's extraordinary. How did we end up in this place?
But there's three main ways that governments collect revenue from the oil and gas industry in Australia, and they're royalties, which are not a tax, they're a payment for the resource, just, as any company pays for its raw materials.
Sorry, like a baker pays for flour or a bricklayer has to pay for bricks. Well, I guess their customer does, but it's a cost of doing business, yeah?
Absolutely. So it's exactly like that. It's just that because the Australian community owns the gas, the payment is made to the Australian community via our governments. And so the gas industry often tries to spin royalties as a tax, but actually it's just a payment for raw materials, and they need to be paying for their raw materials and tax. In reality, they often pay neither.
And those royalties, Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but they are collected at the state government level, yeah?
No, not all of them. The onshore gas and gas that's in state territorial waters is collected by state governments or territorial governments. But all the big offshore gas projects in Commonwealth waters, royalties should be collected by the Australian government, but except for one project, they're not. The government just fails to collect royalties. So it essentially gives the gas away for free.
What do you mean? That's a bit gobsmacking, Mark. What do you mean they just don't collect it? How does that happen?
They've just chosen not to over time. They historically there's a big project called Northwest Shelf off the coast of Western Australia, and that's the only project that the Australian government collects royalties from the oil and gas industry, and it basically lets them off on all the other huge gas export projects around Australia. So more than half the gas that's exported for Australia, we give them for free. And to add to that, 80% of the gas we produce in Australia is exported, and over half of it they get for free.
That is just truly gobsmacking, and it just makes me feel so angry, Mark. That is truly shocking because, as you keep saying, this is a resource that collectively Australians own, and we can only dig it up and export it once, and business is booming and Australians are getting ripped off essentially.
Yeah, that's absolutely what's happening, and I think it's a disgrace really. The governments are meant to be representing our interests, but unfortunately, because of the cosy relationship between a lot of politicians and the gas industry, who after all are almost entirely foreign-owned multinational corporations, our governments over time have just given them so many loopholes that we give them most of the gas they get for free and we tax them very little.
Okay, yet another way we're not collecting revenue from the gas industry.
The gas companies earned an extra $40 billion last year from their exports. But, for example, the change in the PRRT that the opposition's so unhappy about is only going to raise about 1.3% of that. And so my view is that, you know what, when Australian resources are earning extra profits overseas, you want the Australian community to get the benefit from them.
I'm guessing the gas industry also pays company tax like every other company in Australia. Is that right?
Yeah, but not much of it. So I think it's usually under 1% of their total revenue. And many of the biggest companies, the biggest oil and gas exporters, just pay no company tax year after year.
And you only pay company tax on your profits. And we know gas companies have been extremely profitable in recent years. Is the reason for these low collections essentially like extra loopholes and ways like deductions, I guess, and tax concessions?
Yes. Well, it depends on how you look at it. So you would think, given that they have an income of around $100 billion a year, that surely from exporting our gas, most of which they get for free, they'd be incredibly profitable. But they have so many, deductions and exemptions that a lot of them claim to not be making profit at all, therefore have no taxable income. So companies, for instance, Australia Pacific LNG, which is operated by Origin in Queensland, has paid no company tax up to the most recent year we've got data for, which is 2022. Similarly for Queensland Gas Company, similarly for Arrow Energy, similarly for ICHECS LNG off the coast of Northern Territory, who seem to feel very, very able to just throw their weight around politically in Australia. And, there's others as well.
So that's a pretty dire picture then. So over 80% of our gas is getting exported overseas, and of that, 50% we're not paying royalties on.
Over 50%, yep.
Plus, they're not paying much in company tax because they've got deductions and exemptions that reduce their taxable income sometimes to zero.
Yeah.
And how much are they raking in every year?
Around $100 billion. Well, I think it was around $90 billion last year.
Right. So that's the economics of it.
Are you comfortable with Woodside's Scarborough Gas Project at a time when climate scientists are saying that there should be no more new fossil fuel projects?
I'm comfortable with making sure that we transition over a period of time in an orderly way.
But There's a climate aspect to this too, because obviously LNG is a fossil fuel. It makes climate change worse. How much damage are Australia's LNG exports doing to our climate?
Well, so it's kind of impossible to actually understand the full damage that emissions do to the climate. So you can only sort of find metrics that give some kind of a rough estimate. But emissions from gas exports in Australia are over 200 million tonnes a year. And the metric that's used by a lot of companies is called the social cost of carbon. And that's basically the social and economic cost of carbon. And there was an influential study done in 2019 that estimated that the social cost of carbon is per tonne of emissions that our gas exports put into the atmosphere. You can estimate the damage that every tonne of those emissions does to our atmosphere globally is, according to research that's been done, as somewhere between around $250 per tonne and over $1,000 a tonne. And what that means is because our gas exports cause over 200 million tonnes a year of emissions, their damage is somewhere between around $50 billion globally to around $250 billion globally. So enormous.
Yeah, so that cost is kind of looking at if they had to pay for all the damage they do, that's roughly how much it would cost. That's the cost of the damage if we were to kind of charge them for it.
Yeah, or another way to look at it is that's the damage that we, as in everybody in the world, absorbs the cost of, whether it's through, natural disasters or just erosion of our quality of life or destruction of our environment. That's the cost that we all absorb. And the point is that these companies pay none of the costs of those emissions.
So that's another freebie that the gas industry is getting. We don't charge them for all that damage.
No, we pay those costs one way or another.
So when you say we pay those costs one way or another, are you talking there, I'm just trying to think tangibly for our listeners, is that through things like the cost of insurance goes up after climate change fueled natural disasters and extreme weather events? Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about there?
Yeah, absolutely. So those figures I quoted before are the global costs of the emissions from Australia's exports, but obviously it contributes to the damage to the climate, impacts Australia in different ways, and we have more extreme and frequent disasters like fires and floods, and we're all seeing that happen, all over the place now. We're getting much more extreme temperatures on a day-to-day level. These things impact our health. We get property damage. Some of that's insured, but a lot of it isn't. So people absorb a lot of costs from the impact of natural disasters. And when it is insured, we all pay the cost anyway through higher insurance premiums. So people are probably noticing that their premiums are going up like crazy at the moment. The primary reason for that is the impact of fossil fuels on our climate, causing climate change. So that's a very real way that we're experiencing big new costs every year.
As Queenslanders attempt to recover from 2 ex-tropical cyclones, a third cyclone could potentially make landfall next week.
Sydney was soaked overnight, causing mayhem on our roads.
Our emergency crews have had a busy 24 hours clearing fallen trees, fixing leaking ceilings and closing flooded roads.
New figures show 6,500 out of 160,000 house insurance claims from the major fall floods of the past 2 years are still outstanding.
The Brisbane resident faced a 400% increase to her premium.
That's getting to the stage of unaffordable or extreme insurance stress.
Yeah, the actual cost of climate change. So ultimately, we're exporting a lot of gas. Gas companies are raking in revenue. We're not getting much tax out of it in terms of revenue for Australians who own the resource. Plus, on top of that, we're paying through the nose for insurance premiums and other things caused by the climate change that the gas industry is causing. It's it really feels like, excuse my language, but we've got it all ass backwards.
Yeah, I mean, it's really perverse, isn't it, that these companies are causing a huge amount of damage. We're paying all the costs for it, and they're not even paying enough taxes and royalties to give us a return.
Minister for Resources, 68% of emissions under the safeguard mechanism come from corporations and their peak bodies that donated $896,000 to Labor's election campaign, including coal and gas companies. The proposed safeguard mechanism changes won't stop new coal and gas and will allow fossil fuel companies to continue polluting through offsets. Minister, are you willing to make the climate crisis worse by approving new coal and gas projects for your corporate mates?
Why is it a good idea for the Australian government to go further than it is right now and increase the PRRT by more?
Look, we're a low taxing country, and one of the huge opportunities for us to have raised more taxes from the resource industry, particularly the oil and gas industry, and we just haven't done that. And as a result, we've underfunded education, we've underfunded health, we've underfunded housing, and we're in an absolute crisis because we've done that. On top of that, we're being smashed by enormous costs from the damage fossil fuels do to our climate, and that's just going to keep increasing and increasing. And, you know, these industries need to wind down over time, and we absolutely need to stop approving any new projects. But while they're phasing out, we need to collect as much money from them as possible. Otherwise, we're going to be left carrying the can for the damage that they've done, and they're going to make vast profits from it. So, you know, it's really time we got serious about seriously taxing them.
There's nothing we can do to get back the revenue we've already given away by not taxing the gas industry properly, but there's nothing to say we can't make a change right now and make it better in the future. We don't have to keep doing things the way we are right now.
Look, put it this way. Every year they're exporting 80% of the gas that is produced in Australia, 80%. And we're the largest liquefied natural gas exporter or one of the largest liquefied natural gas exporters in the world, right? So every year, vast quantities of gas are sailing overseas and we're getting very little return from it. We need to start taxing them seriously right now because it's sailing overseas as we speak. We are losing billions and billions of dollars every year because we're failing to get a fair return for our resources. So we need to get onto it now.
Thanks, Mark. I think that's all we've got time for.
No worries. Pleasure, Ebony.
This episode was recorded on the 6th of February 2024, and things may have changed since recording. Head on over to australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research and analysis and to sign up to our fortnightly newsletter. If you found today's discussion enlightening, please rate and review us. It helps other people to find the show. And you can find us on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. I'm at Ebony_Bennett and Mark is at Mark Ogge, all one word, that's OGGE. And remember, for a closer look at the economic landscape, subscribe to our new weekly podcast, Dollars and Cents, with Greg Jericho, Chief Economist at the Australia Institute. Thanks for joining us.